never adequately shows up. The amnesty immediately does, and in this proposal, although it might not be immediate citizenship, it's immediate legal protection and many benefits that flow from that. Thank you, Mr. President. I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you. The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, it was July of 1911. A boat arrived in Baltimore, came over from Germany, and among the passengers getting off that boat were a small number of people from Lithuania. They included my grandmother, my aunt, my uncle, and my mom. My mother was 2 years old in 1911, and she was brought to America along with her family as an immigrant. I wish that I'd asked the questions before everyone passed on about how much anyone remembered from that experience, because I've always wondered about it. I always wondered how this family that spoke no English got off that boat and got to East St. Louis, Illinois, which is where I grew up and where a lot of Lithuanian immigrants went to work in the packing houses and the steel mills and the coal mines nearby. But that's the story of the Durbin family, at least my mother's side of it, and it's not a unique story. It's the story of America. My mother came to this country 2 years of age with a mother who didn't speak English, and today her son serves in the United States Senate. It's a great story about this great country. And it also tells a story of how many millions like her came to these shores looking for something that was important in their lives. First and foremost, to feed their children, to get a job. That's always the number one reason. But up in my office here, just a few steps away from the Senate floor, in a desk drawer, I have one thing that was carried in the luggage by my grandmother when she came over from Lithuania. It was a prayer book. It was a Catholic prayer book. We're Roman Catholics. They were leaving Lithuania, where the Russian Tsar had come in and said to the Roman Catholics, if you're not Russian Orthodox, you're going to have to play by different rules. And one of the rules, you can't have any of your prayer books written in Lithuanian. They must be written in Russian. Well, my grandmother, whom I never knew, must have been a defiant and a risk-taking woman, because she had one of these contraband prayer books and brought it with her to America because she knew she could use it here without a problem because of the freedoms in this country. That, again, is a little family story from my life experience, my family experience, but one that could be replicated in many different ways. We just had a press conference upstairs, and you may see some coverage a little later on. There were 5 of us representing 6 senators who've been sitting together and working on this immigration issue. 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. On the Democratic side, I've been honored to join Chuck Schumer of New York and Bob Menendez of New Jersey. On the Republican side, John McCain of Arizona, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Marco Rubio of Florida. Pretty interesting group, right? Pretty interesting political spectrum represented by these 6 senators. And for the last few months, we've been sitting down and working out a statement of principles about immigration reform. And today we unveiled those principles. We have a lot of work to do. We still have to write the law, and we still have to bring it to the Senate to be debated and to be passed. I don't assume for a minute that we're going to have every senator supporting it on both sides of the aisle. That would be too much to consider or to ask. But I know from listening to the speeches that were given by Senator Sessions of Alabama, Senator Vitter of Louisiana, they have many questions that they want to ask about how we approach immigration reform. So let me try, if I can, to speak to some of the basics that are included in our effort. First, when I listened to the senator from Louisiana, he said that President Obama had done little to enforce immigration laws. I think you will find for the record that this president has deported more people in his tenure than predecessors, particularly those who've been associated with criminal activity. In fact, he's received some criticism saying he's going too far. So to argue that he's not enforcing the law is not supported by the facts and the statistics. The senator from Louisiana also said that President Obama was the author of the Fast and Furious program, which was a border effort to try to stop the flow of guns that blew up in the faces of those who engineered it and ended up in the tragic death of one of our own. I would just say for the record, that program began under President Bush, not under President Obama. So there are some facts that we need to put on the record. But I'd like to also speak to a couple elements here that have been raised about this effort on immigration reform. Let's get down to basics. Immigration is part of who we are in America. It is the reason we are such a diverse nation. My family story, as I said, can be repeated over and over again. And every generation has faced a new wave of immigration coming into this country. I think it's a healthy thing. I think there's something in the DNA of those people who get up and come here, who are determined to improve their lives. These people turn out to be the entrepreneurs and the teachers and the leaders of our nation because they weren't content staying in some place where they didn't achieve their goals. They wanted to come to America. So immigration is part of who we are, and the debate over immigration is part of who we are. It's been going on forever. I think as soon as the first boat landed here with immigrants to America, they started questioning whether we needed another boatload of immigrants. That debate has gone on throughout our history. There have been some terrible things done in the name of immigration reform and some good things as well. Secondly, immigration and the demand for immigration says a great deal about America. People want to come here. Says a lot about it, doesn't it? Here we are in a democracy with the freedoms we enjoy and an economy that offers such wonderful opportunities, and people from all over the world, given a choice, would come here for their future. That's a positive thing. But the third thing is our immigration system is broken down. I got elected about 16 years ago to the Senate. One of the first phone calls came from Senator Ted Kennedy, chair of the Immigration Subcommittee of Judiciary. And he said, "Welcome to the Judiciary Committee. Please come on my Immigration Subcommittee." I said, "Well, thank you. I'm really honored that you'd ask." He said, "We're about to rewrite the immigration laws. We haven't done it for 10 years. The last time was under President Reagan. Now we're going to do it again. And we need you to be part of it." Oh, I signed up in a hurry. It didn't happen. And 16 years have passed. So for 25 years plus, we haven't looked at this immigration law, and it's broken. It's broken badly. It's broken when we have 11 or 12 million people living here who are undocumented. Many of them came here on legal visas and overstayed their visas. Some did sneak across the border to come into the United States. There are a variety of explanations, but they're here. I've come to know them. For many people who aren't in this business, maybe you don't know them. But I'll tell you who they are. They happen to be the person who just took the plates off your table at the restaurant. They're the ones who are unloading the food at the dock behind the restaurant. They'll be making the beds in the hotel rooms across America tonight. A lot of them are in the daycare centers with our children and grandchildren, whom we dearly love every day. Some are tending to our parents and grandparents who are in nursing homes. And some of them have just sat down next to you in church on a regular basis. They're undocumented. They don't talk about it. They don't wear it on their sleeves. Many of them are afraid to say anything. And they don't live in a house full of undocumented people. By and large, you're going to find families split up. You may find Dad, who's been here the longest, who qualified under the Reagan amnesty in 1986. He's a legal citizen. Mom is not. All 3 children born here are. There's a family that is literally split by our immigration system. That's the reality of what we see in America today. And the question is, how did we reach this point? What can we do about it? And we now are sitting down on a bipartisan basis to address it. First, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can reasonably do at the border to keep illegal immigration down, to reduce it as low as possible. I know, as I said earlier, there are people from all over the world who want to come here. But for those who suggest we're not doing enough at the border, I would like to call their attention to a recent press release from the Migration Policy Institute. It says in this press release is from January 7th of this year, the U.S. government spends more on federal immigration enforcement than in all other principal federal criminal law enforcement agencies combined. With nearly $18 billion spent in fiscal 2012, approximately 24% higher than the collective spending for the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. So to argue that this president is not enforcing the law when we have so many deportations, and to argue that he's not taking it seriously when we are spending record-breaking amounts on the border, just isn't backed up by the facts. But still, we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep the border safe and to reduce illegal immigration. That's the first thing. The second thing is to say that those who are here, if they want to be legal, have to earn their way to legal status. How do they earn it? First, they go through a criminal background check. We don't want anyone here who is a threat to our nation or to the people who live here. They'll be asked to leave. In fact, they'll be forced to leave. But those who pass the criminal background check, they'll need to pay a fine. They have to pay their taxes. And then they can stay and work in a legal, probationary legal status while we make the border safe. Ultimately, they have to be able to speak English, learn our history and civics, and then go through a lengthy process before they are granted, even possibly granted, citizenship. We also say at the same time that we're going to build into this system enforcement in the workplace. What brings most people to America? Jobs. It's all about a job. And if in the workplace we have real enforcement where we have an identification card from those who are seeking a job and an obligation on the part of the employer to make sure that they are registered in this country, then we can start to have a system of enforceability. We also need, and this Senator Rubio of Florida has been pushing this, we also need to make sure that when it comes to visas in the United States, when we allow people to travel here to be tourists or students or for business purposes, and they have an expiring visa, that they leave when they're supposed to. Our system now is not as good as it should be. We want to strengthen that system. That is part of what we need to do. I think immigration reform is long overdue. This immigration system we have is badly broken and needs to be fixed. And we need to take the leadership here in Washington. This bipartisan group of senators has started an effort in that direction. We have a long, long way to go. We have to write the bill. We hope to have it done, we hope by March, and we hope to bring it to the committee process for regular hearings, for amendment process, and everything that entails. That, to me, will make sense in the long run. In the meantime, I want to say a word about the DREAM Act. I introduced that bill 12 years ago. It was referred to on the floor here. It's worth a minute or two to recount why I introduced the bill. We received a phone call in our office from a program in Chicago known as the Merit Music Program. It's a program, a wonderful program. A lady left some money for it and said use the money to buy musical instruments for kids in poor schools and give them lessons, music lessons. What an amazing transformation it creates in their lives. 100% of the graduates of the Merit Music Program go to college, all of them. It just is an amazing thing what a musical experience will do for a young person. Well, there was a young Korean girl named Teresa Lee who came from an extremely poor family. She became part of the Merit Music Program and turned out to be an accomplished pianist. She was encouraged to apply to go to Juilliard School of Music and Manhattan Conservatory of Music. She was so good. And as she started to fill out the application, she stopped and she turned to the person at the program and said, I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm undocumented. I've never told anybody that, but I don't know why I'm wasting my time with this. At which point, they called our office and said, what can we do for Teresa? Well, it turned out the law was very clear. She had to leave the United States for 10 years to go back to Brazil, which was the last country she was in, and then apply to come to the United States. And that seemed unfair. She was brought here when she was 2 years old. She didn't vote on that. Her parents picked her up and brought her here. And I started thinking, I'll bet there are others just like her. And it turns out there are hundreds of thousands. So I introduced the DREAM Act, and here's what it said. If you were brought to the United States before the age of 16, you finish high school, you have no serious criminal issues, and you are prepared to either enlist in our military or finish at least 2 years of college, we'll give you a chance to become a citizen. I introduced it 12 years ago. I've called it on the floor over and over again. The senator from Louisiana is correct. The Senate didn't pass it. We couldn't get 60 votes to break a Republican filibuster on the DREAM Act. We had a majority. We just didn't have 60. And that was several years ago. So President Barack Obama, who was my colleague in the Senate before he was elected president and was a co-sponsor of the DREAM Act, said, I am going to suspend the deportation of those young people who would be eligible under the DREAM Act. And he did. It went into effect last August. Congressman Luis Gutierrez of Chicago is a great leader on this immigration reform. He and I held a workshop at Navy Pier, which is a big gathering place in Chicago, in August for those who would be eligible for this deferral of deportation under the DREAM Act. We never dreamed, Mr. President, that they'd start lining up at midnight the night before. They'd stay out there all night long with their families, waiting for a chance to sign up. It was just such a heartwarming experience to know how much this meant, not only to the young person, but many times to their undocumented parents who thought, at least my child will get this chance. So some criticize the President for making this decision, but two-thirds of the American people, Democrats and Republicans alike, think it was the right decision, and I do too. I've met these dreamers. I've talked about them on the floor over and over again. I'll continue to. But these young people will make this a better country, and they deserve a chance to do just that. So those who are critical of the DREAM Act are basically saying that these young people aren't needed in this country. I think they are. They've spent their whole lives being educated here. They've gotten up every morning at school, put their hand on their heart, and pledged allegiance to that great flag, believing this is their country too. They deserve a chance to make it such. Marco Rubio of Florida and I have worked on this DREAM Act issue. He said something that I remember and would like to recount. He said, this isn't an immigration issue. This is an issue of compassion and humanitarianism. These were kids when they were brought here. They deserve this chance. So I know that this will be included in any immigration reform, and I certainly hope that we will pass it and pass it soon. We spoke to the President last night. Senator Schumer and I had a conversation with him. Tomorrow he'll be making a statement in Nevada about immigration. He's committed to immigration reform. He's committed to fixing this system. He told us that what we're setting out to do is generally consistent with what he wants to see done, but he did tell us, get it done. Don't let this drag out again. Seize the moment and move forward with it. Well, we have that chance, Mr. President. We've got to do it. We've got to do it because this nation of immigrants, this nation that will still attract immigrants, needs a legal system that works for those who are here and those who want to come here. We've got to make sure that we are sensitive to the fact that Americans should receive the first preference for jobs, and that will be included in our bill, but also beyond that, jobs that some Americans don't want in agriculture, for example, and in other areas. We need some people coming in to help, and they can be part of this immigration reform as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President,
Senator from Florida,
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
without objection.
Madam President, I want to speak on one of the topics of the day. A group of bipartisan senators have had a press conference today announcing their support for a comprehensive immigration reform piece of legislation. This is a significant step, and perhaps the biggest step was on the way to immigration reform was the result of the November 6th election. As a matter of fact, it has been chronicled in all of the newspapers that overwhelmingly the Hispanic community in every state voted overwhelmingly for the candidate that was perceived to be fair on the immigration issue. And I think that has propelled political motivation to address this issue and to address it fairly. And I want to commend that bipartisan group of senators for doing this. There are a number of key elements that as we then get into the specifics of the legislation that is going to be important. Notice that they want to lay everything on the predicate that there's going to be the essence of a real border security effort done. And it's hard to patrol a border of thousands and thousands of miles like we have, particularly where there is no geographical barrier and people can merely walk across the border. But it has to be done in the context of the overall immigration reform. Another interesting part that has been very thorny in the business community is the fact of verification by employers. When this senator was a young congressman and voting on immigration back in the 1980s, as a matter of fact, there was supposed to be verification by employers that those that they were hiring were here in a documented status. Well, that never happened. And as a result, you see all of these head fakes in implementing the law about whether or not somebody was here in a documented status, and then when they were found not to be, everybody pointing like this, well, it's the other guy's fault. So there has to be a verification system put in place. Some have suggested electronic verification. That needs to be explored. There are going to have to be a lot of new things being explored in order to make sure, if we're going to have a comprehensive immigration reform, that those that are being employed here, in fact, are in a documented status. But the big question in the past politically has been, what about the 11 million that are estimated to be in this country working and in an undocumented status? And I think the principles laid out by the group earlier today are very good. They must play by the rules. They must not have a criminal record. They must pay back taxes, must pay a fine, and then go to the end of the line. Even though they would be allowed a legal status to stay here and to continue working, and that's another one of the elements, that they must have a job and demonstrate that they've had a job in the past, that it wouldn't be fair for all of them suddenly to get in at the head of the line when others have been waiting patiently in the legal process of getting a green card. And thus, you would not have this economic upheaval as some here have approached this issue in the past year. We haven't heard a lot of this since the election, but previous to that, we heard a lot about send them all home, self-deportation, deport all of the illegals. Well, first of all, there would be an economic collapse of part of the economies of this country if you suddenly eliminated all of those workers upon whom the economy certainly is dependent upon. And it also, in many cases, would not be fair. Now, there's another part of this that needs to be added, and this is the fairness question for the children that came here through no fault of their own. They've grown up thinking they're only American, and then the current law is they've got to be deported. Well, this senator has intervened in a number of cases of children that wanted to go into the military after high school, wanted to go on to college, and they were at the point of being deported. As a matter of fact, we had a Bahamian child that had come when he was 6 months old. He only knew he was American. He served 2 tours in Iraq in the United States Army, came back, went into the Navy Reserves, had a top-secret clearance, was a photographer for the Navy at Guantanamo Prison, and came back, and the authorities put him in jail. A veteran, someone who was still active duty U.S. Navy Reserves. And a U.S. federal judge of Cuban-American descent made a very harsh statement in Miami toward the prosecutors for them putting a child, now an adult, now a veteran, having served both the Army and the Navy, with a top-secret clearance, putting that Bahamian, now adult, in jail. This is how ridiculous the system has got. And this senator had to intervene in this case. And once we raised enough cane, finally people came to their senses and said, what is the common sense thing to do? Well, the common sense thing now for us to do is all to pass a comprehensive immigration reform law. And hopefully that's going to occur. Now the question is, though, what's going to happen at the other end of the hall, down there in the House of Representatives? Because there are a lot of people down there that haven't changed their attitude in the other party since the election. They still are expressing that they don't want anything but deportation. I think we're just going to have to use common sense and moderation and try to explain why this is the fair thing to do. As a young congressman, I favored this comprehensive approach decades ago. I've voted for it as a senator. I will gladly, once they knit together the legislation, I will gladly be one of the co-sponsors of this legislation. And I want to thank the bipartisan group of senators that got together, which includes my colleague from Florida, Senator Rubio, for them willing to take the initiative and to start plowing new ground of legislation that ought to be able to be passed this year. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. President. I ask that the call of the quorum be vacated.
Without objection. Senator from Maryland. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 152, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 2, H.R. 152, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending
Madam
September
President,
30th.
I ask unanimous consent that everything be considered as read.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise to urge my colleagues to immediately pass this urgent supplemental bill without further delay. To remind my colleagues and those who are watching us on global C-SPAN, I want to just say this is the bill that will pay for disaster relief to help our citizens, both as individuals, business, and as communities, rebuild their lives after the devastating, horrific impact of Hurricane Sandy. Particularly, it will impact on the residents of New York and New Jersey. It will also, my own state was affected. In my own state, Madam President, we had two things happen. A hurricane, in the old-fashioned definition of that word hit the eastern shore, and up in western Maryland, right up in our Appalachian part, we had a blizzard. And it took the National Guard to be able to go into the streets. So we had people being rescued on swift boats and on snowmobiles. It was something. And at the same time, I think all of America watched what was going on up the coast, but particularly on New Jersey and New York. Many other states were also impacted by this storm. Homes and businesses were damaged and destroyed. And they had been waiting for 90 days for help from their government to help them rebuild their lives and rebuild their livelihoods. I, therefore, tonight ask immediate, urgent action to move this bill. It is not perfect, but it is a very sound bill. It's the bill that was passed by the Senate in December was a superior bill. The House bill, which is before us, eliminates many important provisions that the Senate passed. I'll go into that. But I urge my colleagues, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. We've got to get started. We have to help our communities. They've been waiting. Governor Cuomo, Governor Christie, Governor O'Malley have all said, move it. We need help. And move it we need to. So I say that there were things that came back to the House from the Senate-passed bill that I'm not too excited about. They reduce the cost share requirements for Army Corps projects. In other words, the local government will have to pay more. They reduce funding for fisheries, for flexibility to help our State Department. In a perfect world, I would seek to amend this bill and ask for a conference with the House so we could work out these differences. But even though this House bill is not perfect, it does give critical relief to the people who need it. Therefore, passing this bill is my top priority. This bill totals $50.5 billion for Hurricane Sandy recovery efforts. When combined with the $9.7 billion of flood insurance that we passed earlier this month, along with assistance for Hurricane Sandy related with recovery, this bill meets the current needs of the recovery efforts and should be approved without delay. Let me take a few minutes to discuss some of the important issues. There's $16 billion in there for Community Development Block Grant to restore infrastructure and housing to help people rebuild their lives. There's $11.5 billion in the FEMA Disaster Fund for ongoing disaster response, $10 billion for public transportation, particularly crucial in the New York and New Jersey area, $5.3 billion for the Army Corps of Engineers to help protect communities along our shorelines, and $500 million for the social service block grant to meet compelling human needs like child care, mental health services, and also for programs that will help with very damaged facility that met compelling needs. As I said, Madam President, Governors Cuomo and Christie have identified needs totaling billions of dollars more than this legislation provides. That doesn't even include other states, like my own of Maryland. The funding in this bill is urgently needed. Every dollar has been examined. Hurricane Sandy was one of the most destructive storms to ever hit the United States. Hundreds of thousands of families have seen their lives turned upside down. They've waited far too long for this legislation to reach the President. I strongly urge the support of this legislation, and this is the very first bill as the full chair of the Appropriations Committee I'm moving. I want to acknowledge the role of the subcommittee chairman, because in that committee, the subcommittees really carry the bulk of the work. Senator Landrieu of the Subcommittee on Homeland Security, under which FEMA is her jurisdiction, has done an outstanding job of making sure we meet compelling human need and at the same time get value for our dollar. Senator Patty Murray chairs the subcommittee that funds housing and transportation, again, to make sure that we're rebuilding homes and livelihoods. Senator Feinstein on the Army Corps of Engineers, again, while they've been doing a heroic job keeping the Mississippi River open, they want to make sure the shoreline of New York and New Jersey and Maryland is open for business as well. I could name all of them, but those three have done an outstanding job. And I particularly want to acknowledge the help of my colleagues from New York and New Jersey. Senator Schumer has led the way, particularly when there was this difficult time with Senator Inouye's illness to move this bill. But Senator Gillibrand, Menendez, and Lautenberg have really been outstanding. So this is about colleagues, and I want to thank our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who helped us. I know that I really would now like to yield the floor to Senator Landrieu, who has done such a great job through her subcommittee, and ask her to elaborate on the aspects, particularly on disaster response and recovery.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank my colleague for her really extraordinary and robust and enthusiastic leadership for this important piece of legislation that will send hope and help to the Northeast, to the dozens of counties throughout New York, New Jersey, and even in the state of Maryland and other states that are waiting on pins and needles for our action. And, Madam President, it has been too long. We have sent too many different signals out from this Capitol. The people following this debate, the mayors, the county commissioners, the school board members, the citizens, the pastors of churches, the principals of schools, need to hear today a big yes from Congress and a yes from the President that help is on the way. Believe me, as a senator for Louisiana, unfortunately, I have become an expert on disasters and disaster recovery, and I can tell you from personal witness and testimony the importance of every action we take regarding this recovery, so that the private sector, and I want my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to hear this, so that the private sector, not taxpayer money, but the private sector will have the confidence that the government will be there and they will begin to invest themselves. But this is a big effort, and until the federal government acts, and we have already delayed this further than it should have been because we're arguing over offsets. And I want to put in the record this statement. When our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan needed ammunition, equipment, and better protection against roadside bombs, we sent them what they needed as quickly as we could get it there. We didn't make them wait and sit around bandaging their wounds while we debated about offsets and how we were going to deal with those explosives. We should respond with the same sense of urgency to our fellow citizens and address emergency needs on U.S. soil. It has already been 3 months since Hurricane Sandy. If this Lee amendment is adopted, it will be delayed further. I strongly oppose the Lee amendment, and I want to talk a minute more about why, and I'm going to turn it over to Senator Schumer and others on the floor. We should not use disasters as an excuse to push ideology. And that's, I'm afraid, what the other side is doing. They want to look for any excuse to cut the budget. I want to say again, we've already cut this budget by $1.5 trillion. And I want to say for the 11th, 12th, 13th time, we're never going to cut our way to a balanced budget. I want my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to hear it. We're not going to cut our way to a balanced budget. It is going to be a combination of revenue increases and cuts, which I'm all for. And the last negotiation that we did was exactly that Vice President Biden and President Obama negotiated. A combination of revenues and reductions. All the Lee amendment does is reduce again. He does not offer one new penny to pay for this. He wants to cut it from veterans. He wants to cut it from firefighters. He wants to cut it for police officers. I'm not going to join him in that. It's a wrong-headed approach. If we want to find a way to pay for disasters, I'll show up and negotiate with anybody. But it's not going to be just by cutting defense budget or discretionary budget. It's going to be about either raising some additional revenues and cutting. You will have me. Until then, put me down as a no. And I'm going to suggest to all of my colleagues today that they vote no on the Lee amendment if we get to these votes, and yes on the underlying bill. One more word, 2 minutes, about the underlying bill, because the senators from the region know it much better than I do. I agree with the chairman from Maryland. The Senate bill was far better in some ways. Not only did it have a little bit more money in it, but it had some important tools for reform. Unfortunately, the House stripped some of those out. However, and some of them will affect the Gulf Coast in a negative way, but even though it affects the Gulf Coast in a negative way, common sense things, particularly a loan modification provision that would have forced FEMA to actually calculate the repayment in a rational way instead of an irrational way. It would have helped some of the parishes in Louisiana. Senator Vitter and I fought very hard for that. We think that it's fiscally responsible. We think it's the right thing to do. But you know what? The House stripped it out. But we're still going to vote. I hope he will, and I know I will, for this bill, because, again, we can't make, the perfect the enemy of the good. This is a good bill that the people need. We're not going to get every reform that we had sought, but we're going to get the bulk of them. And I have to end by saying I thank Republicans and Democrats on the House side, Peter King, Nita Lowey, that came together to preserve some of the reforms, Madam President, because it would be like sending money with dull tools. That's a waste of taxpayer money. You want to send the money and the toolbox with sharp tools that people can use, and that's what we put in this bill. So I'm proud to have worked on that part. There are many other parts. No leader was better than Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Menendez, Senator Lautenberg, but the part that we worked on were preserving the reforms that we learned we needed, and now I'm happy to be able to give some of that help to the people of the Northeast, even though some of our amendments were stripped out. And I know there are other members to speak, so I'll yield the floor and submit the rest in writing to the record.
Senator from Indiana.
Madam President, I know there's a lot of passion on the floor here regarding this particular legislation. Probably no one on this floor has not had some semblance of a disaster in their state that they represent and the people. Sandy clearly rises to one of the top categories of something truly catastrophic, but many of us have experienced tornadoes and destruction and floods and a number of other disasters, and clearly one of the essential functions of government is to address those in immediate need and meet some of those emergency needs. And the cooperation with local and state authorities and federal authorities stepping up, we've been able to assure the American people that help is on the way. And hopefully help is on the way in an expeditious manner so that it gets to those who need that emergency help quickly. It's regrettable that it's taken this long for some of this money to be appropriated. I personally think that we could have expedited this had we gained the support for an amendment I offered in December, which would have met immediately emergency needs, but yet given the Congress time to work through the process of examining other aspects of the bill that, number one, were not related to Sandy, number two, that fell on various members' wish lists of things that they wanted done for their state. Of course, that's their responsibility to do so. But we all know that when you see a train moving out of the station that's going to be passed and going to become law, there's been a temptation through the years to add unrelated matters to that particular bill, knowing that it'll get attached to the train and ultimately voted on and supported. We saw what happened during the fiscal cliff debate we had 15 minutes or so to examine the final bill, and of course later all these egregious examples of spending that had nothing to do with the issue itself, but were tacked on at the last minute. And so really what we were trying to talk about here is a process that I believe, and I think a number of members believe, is necessary to vet every spending appropriation that comes before this body, to ensure that it meets the essential function, to ensure that it is not loaded up with extraneous matters, to ensure that we are making the most careful use of taxpayer dollars as is possible. It's not an ideology. It's those of us responding to some very basic math that shows us that we have a decreasing capacity to address these types of emergencies, to address education spending, to address medical research spending, to address transportation spending, to pave roads, to rebuild bridges, to address any number of discretionary items that we can debate the value of. That is shrinking dramatically. And so if we don't apply at least some discipline to how we evaluate and how we examine how we're going to go forward, without continuing to plunge into debt and to borrow money, which is ultimately unsustainable, then I think we're shirking our duty here. I'm not down here to talk against funding for this disaster. I'm down here to discuss how we together, Republicans and Democrats, need to apply some discipline to how we make decisions. It's been a time-honored practice here.